need to take your mug. Yeah.
Let's get started.
Hey, Matt, you know what time it is?
Oh, it's Cloud Simplified time. I'm looking forward to it today. Who do we have as our guest today, Ryan?
We have Brian Harrison on with us today, one of our distinguished colleagues who's done a lot in the security space and helped some of our financial customers do some interesting things in trying to lock down and isolate some of their IT assets that they might be having hosted in Azure, or that they might actually allow Azure to connect to in a hybrid type manner.
Oh, that's great, because I know that's a lot of conversations that I have with customers just like him, so I'm ready to get started.
All right. So, Brian, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be in the world. My name is Brian Harrison. I am a cloud solution architect. I've been a cloud solution architect at Microsoft now for the last little over 3 years. Was a solution architect for one of the other cloud vendors prior to that. Been in the cloud space for a long time. Love the cloud space very, very much. And as both of you mentioned, one of the customers that I've worked with in the last 3 to 6 months has been in the financial services space. But to Matt's point, I've heard these kinds of requests from other industries as well, where they want to put applications in the cloud. They know they're going to get a cost benefit, but they don't know how to create an isolated system like they've done in their data centers, where they know and can guarantee that no one's going to be able to touch those systems other than exactly who they want to touch those systems. And that's true of whether it's a standard user request or the administrators who are actually monitoring and managing those systems. So I wanted to talk about how you can absolutely do that in the public cloud today and feel very, very comfortable and secure in that you will get the isolated system just like in your on-prem data centers.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely an important topic. And I know, as with many cloud service vendors, there are services that are publicly accessible. So things like storage, as an example. There's an endpoint that you might use programmatically with an application you might have deployed. It's essentially hitting a public URL, but you might be storing something very non-public, and in fact, actually something that you want to protect, crown jewels, if you will. So hopefully we could talk a little bit about how to protect some of those things and how to overcome some fears that maybe customers have when they see that and say, oh my goodness, this is looks public, but when in fact they have a lot of control and flexibility over controlling access to that. So hopefully we can simplify that too.
Absolutely, and those absolutely will be some of the topics that I'll be talking about.
All right, sounds good. So why don't we go ahead and kick it over? Kick it over to you. I know that you have some material and some slides that you were going to share to kind of walk through and get some conversation started.
Absolutely. So in order to really talk about isolated systems, let me at least give you some overview first of some of the things that I've had conversations about when working with my customers. Now, unfortunately, I can't give you specifics of who the customers are. Financial services customers are very, very security and privacy conscious. So, but I can at least talk about a production environment that went into production, I believe it's been about a month ago now, and how we actually brought that architecture together. So the first thing is, what actually is an isolated system? And most customers think about an isolated system as one where the access to that system is extremely limited. And I mean that from both the user request perspective as well as from the perspective of an administrator or a developer who needs to monitor, maintain, and potentially update the system. So in the case of the cloud, you are going to be able to leverage things like virtual networks, where you have complete control over input and output of everything that is inside of that virtual network. And if you're just doing it inside of the public cloud, well, then that is considered an isolated system, depending upon who is going to be accessing it from an internal perspective. However, most customers want to be able to create an isolated system that maybe doesn't have a public endpoint. So Ryan, you had brought up a little while ago about the fact that many services in the public cloud do by default have public endpoints. And in the public cloud, you've got two distinct areas of service. You've got infrastructure as a service and you've got platform as a service. Infrastructure as a service you have complete control over. If you want to put a public IP on something, you can, but by default, it's all private. Well, what happens when you want to use platform services? You mentioned storage. Databases are another common one. So a customer might very well want to create an isolated system, but leverage all of the great goodness that the public cloud gives you. And how can that be done? But they also want to make sure that maybe a particular system isn't accessible from the public. Maybe this is an application that should only be used internally, an intranet, for example, although that term is not necessarily used anymore. They want to make sure that only the people in their company can access those systems. How is that possible? And Matt, you talked about the term hybrid. That's really where the hybrid cloud comes into play. And how can you create a hybrid cloud using Azure? So
that's a great point. I want to just take a quick pause there for you, Brian, because that was, I think that's one of the things that stands out to me quite often at times is FinServ customers who I've dealt with in the past or healthcare customers I've dealt with in the past oftentimes are like, look, it's great that we have this PaaS service, but you know, I don't like the fact that everybody goes to the same place, and how do we get sorted out at the end? Because I think that's also a common concern is how does this one public endpoint really kind of understand who's who and who's authenticating to what, right? So I think that would also be good to just to kind of cover for our viewers. Absolutely.
And that is going to very much depend upon where that public endpoint is sitting from the cloud perspective. In the case of my customer, we were actually deploying a completely internal application. There was going to be no public accessibility to this system at all. It was basically a SharePoint application that was just used internally by the company. So we didn't have to worry about public endpoints. However, they absolutely wanted to use those publicly accessible services. Now, though, back to your question, if a customer does deploy a system that, let's say, has a public URL, but their internal users are going to be coming in from a private URL, private IP address, whatever it might happen to be, then you absolutely need to make sure to monitor and audit what is happening on those endpoints. And that's where the term governance really comes into play. Now, governance has gotten to be a little bit of an overloaded term. However, it is still, in my opinion, the very first step that every customer needs to go through before deploying anything in the cloud.
Oh, and hands down agree. Yeah, hands down agree.
Yeah, and I completely agree too. There's been some customers, highly regulated customers I've been involved with as well that have, that using storage as an example, that they deploy a workload, security, info security or infosec teams look at it and they're like, oh my goodness, you're gonna, this has a public IP address. What you're going to put what, where, and that's where kind of establishing some hygiene around that earlier rather than later is important.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Matt, you had mentioned, I'll be talking about a FinServ customer. You also mentioned healthcare. I've spent a lot of time in the public sector and federal. This comes up a lot in the federal space, especially for those non-publicly facing websites for the particular agencies that are sitting out there.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Now, when I talk about governance with respect to the cloud, I'm talking about three distinct things. Now, the top two are their actual service names inside of Azure, resource policies in particular. Resource policies you can think of as being able to control what is creatable, updatable, deletable inside of Azure. Basically preventing sprawl, if you will, within your Azure subscription. So a great example is if you're using a lot of infrastructure as a service. In FinServ, that's exactly what they are starting with, is a lot of infrastructure. But as I mentioned, they want to leverage the goodness of platform. Let's say, for example, that they're using a lot of VMs. Well, we've got a lot of different VM sizes. Some of them are really super expensive. FinServer, guess what? They're cost conscious, as you would expect them to be. Mm-hmm. So they want to prevent certain VM sizes from ever being used because they know they don't have a use for them. So a resource policy can be put in place in order to make sure that only up to D3s are ever deployed inside of their subscription. That's just as an example. However, in the case of my financial services customer that I worked with, they actually really took resource policies and turned it on its head to a degree. Let's use storage again. there are a lot of ways that you can configure storage. One of them, Ryan, you were mentioning earlier, by default has a public endpoint, but we want to configure it so that it has a private endpoint. Well, in financial services, healthcare, public sector, you also want to make sure that all of the data coming in and out is encrypted. You want to make sure that the data at rest is encrypted. And you can actually create policies inside of your subscriptions or at the resource group level, and I'm going to demonstrate all of this a little bit later, so that you can guarantee that every new storage account that gets created does have SSL turned on as far as data in transit is concerned, does have storage encryption turned on or server-side encryption turned on for data at rest, things like that, so that you can make sure that everything that does get deployed inside of Azure meets all of your security and privacy concerns, sticking to the idea of an isolated system.
So this governance kind of in also a way is some really kind of detailed plan that needs and thought that goes into this, because if you don't, I think customers typically find themselves in a uh-oh moment, or security comes along and does a kind of an audit of the deployment and finds out, oh no, you actually have been open this entire time, or you didn't have what you were thought you had configured correctly, right? So I think people overlook this is just as serious as planning a new data center, right? So I like what you're saying, and I think this oftentimes is the most overlooked topic I ever see when people are thinking about cloud, right?
Yeah. You know why it's overlooked, I think? Because it's boring.
Oh yeah, no, who wants to sit there and plan hours and hours of role-based access, right?
Yeah, right,
yeah, absolutely.
Right. But
there's not a lot of technical fun here.
Yeah.
Yeah, cut my wrist. Oh.
Yeah. So with what you put in place with some of your financial services and government customers, now this using these policies that you show us, this pacified all of their security concerns and being able to allow or empower their IT organizations to move other workloads. I mean, was this a kind of a universal capability that was able to address some of their concerns?
Some. I want to make sure to underline the word some.
So this is not the silver bullet. Come on. This is not the silver bullet?
As much as I would love to say Azure solves all of the world's problems, it doesn't. And resource policies is a fairly new feature. And when I say fairly new, within a year. So not every type of policy for every type of resource is going to be out there for you to create or even be able to plug into. So there, I'll give you one good example. This particular financial services customer, once again, because they are so security conscious, they rotate keys every 60 days.
Yeah.
So, and they want to make sure that they're client-side keys. Okay, no problem. We support that in almost every single type of thing that they were doing. However, there are no policies today that plug into Azure Key Vault, which is our client management or our key management service.
Okay.
So they can't guarantee, for example, when you turn on encryption on a storage account, that it does actually put the key into Key Vault, and that Key Vault is automatically rotating those keys every 60 days.
Yeah, but it seems like that we're making progress towards, as we consider our enterprise customers and why they want cloud and how to secure cloud, that we're definitely making advancements in this space. It doesn't like we're sitting still, right?
Oh, absolutely. I sat on many calls with the product teams for both storage as well as Key Vault and listened to what the roadmap is. And the customer felt comfortable with where things were, knowing that in the next 6 months, they were going to be right perfectly where they wanted to be. Even if we couldn't get them there today, they knew we were going to be getting them there very soon.
Great. So that maybe this is a shameful or shameless plug for any of our viewers that are watching, that if you have those kinds of conversations or questions about roadmap, reach out to your account teams and they can work with us, solution architects, and we can help bring that to you. So I just wanted to plug that for our viewers.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so let's check out some of the network policies and capabilities that you put into place for some of your customers.
Absolutely. Now, real quickly, let me just cover the last two. Role-based access control, I think everyone understands what that is. That's user-based, who can do what, when, and where. That's absolutely something, Ryan and Matt, both to your points, should absolutely be done step one. Don't be trying to implement this later. and then monitoring and auditing. The one thing you would, Ryan, you had asked, was resource policies the silver bullet? Was it going to provide everything? It does tremendous efforts with respect to prevention. The one thing it doesn't do is auditing. So, and I'll give you a great example of this. My customer had talked about implementing a specific policy, and when we covered what the specifics were of the policy, we found out that resource policies didn't have the functionality yet. Okay, but we knew it was going to be coming in the next 3 to 6 months, probably more so like 3. And he said, well, okay, if I go and implement this policy 3 months from now, but I've now had 3 months of users implementing things that might be against that policy, how can I go back and fix the problem? Or how can I at least get an audit report against the policy to go, hey, I have these resources that are no longer in compliance? And unfortunately, resource policies doesn't provide that functionality. I know that the engineering teams are working on that, but it's not quite there yet. So that is one thing I at least wanted to point out with respect to auditing. That's where really auditing comes into play. You're going to want to pay attention to what people are doing, and that's in the activity log. I'll show that in a little bit, where you can actually see who might have gone in and created something they weren't supposed to.
Okay. No, good, because I was going to say maybe that's probably the mitigation factors, the activity log. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, and I'll show that in a little bit. Now, Ryan, to the networking. The most common networking design that I have seen with financial services customers in particular, but when wanting to design one or more, and this absolutely is true when you want to design multiple isolated systems, is the hub and spoke design. The hub and spoke design starts with a central VNet or virtual network where you can create and provide centralized shared services, things like DNS, SMTP, jump boxes, things of that nature. And then you peer additional networks or spoke networks off of that one, thereby centralizing, one, the access point that users are going to use to get to your systems, but also you can centralize where the access is coming from your on-prem networks. So in my financial services customer case, they had created a hub VNet where they had put their DNS servers, they were putting their log servers, they were putting a number of different shared services, and they had created that hub network in each region. They were leveraging 6 different Azure regions, and a hub network existed in each one. They then were able to limit the number of VPN connections from their on-prem offices to just those hub networks. For those of you who do not know, and I'm going to be talking about this in a little bit, but the most common way to create a VPN connection is, especially in an isolated form, is ExpressRoute. But ExpressRoute has limitations on the number of virtual networks that it can be created to. So using the hub and spoke design, you can absolutely keep yourself under that limitation by saying that ExpressRoute only needs to be connected to that hub virtual network. Therefore, you only need to create ExpressRoute from each of your offices to that one virtual network. Makes your life a whole lot simpler from a networking design perspective.
So it's more like a tree model almost in a way.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And I've seen customers embrace this approach as well, where you mentioned shared services, but I've seen it used also when there might be a centrally managed IT subscription or resource group that they want to constrain and heavily control, and maybe allow other, let's just use a staging environment maybe for an application that might live in one of those other subnets or other networks rather that are peered back, and it allows their security teams and their central IT teams to kind of control specific traffic and what ports and what IP ranges can actually talk to those shared services from those other environments that maybe they don't have as much control over.
Right. Yeah. And that goes back to the role-based access control. It provides you that segmented way of saying who can do what with respect to all of the systems that have been deployed.
Yep. Okay.
One thing for those of you who might be new to Azure networking and may have never heard the term peering before, that is a fairly new feature within our networking. Came out about 6 to 9 months ago, and basically what it allows you to do is hook multiple networks together so that they look like they're all one network, making traffic flowing between those networks much, much easier, much faster. You don't have to worry about building the routing. You don't have to worry about designing VPN connections between them. You're going to be living on the Azure backbone for all of that traffic. Makes your life a whole lot simpler.
The way I like to describe it is just taking a Ethernet cable and plugging it in from one network to another.
It's a very long one, Ryan. Very long.
Yeah. Yes. Well, not so much if it's all in the same region, but if you're going across regions, then yes.
Yeah. So this is also a much more cost-effective method too, right? Instead of having to do site-to-site VPN gateways all over the place, and their limitations.
That's right.
So, yeah,
you're not limiting, and to your point about limitations, with site-to-site gateways, you're limited on bandwidth. Peering, you're on the Azure backbone. Yeah. So 25 gig a second is what you're going to get.
Call that the Autobahn.
Yeah, I know if you had a VPN tunnel there, I know that the fastest throughput we can sustain with the largest VPN gateway is 1.25 gigabits. So talking 25x, magnitude in performance. So that's definitely a preferred way to wire things up. And I think that one thing that I think is important to highlight here is this goes back and underscores what you just highlighted earlier about governance. I wouldn't necessarily classify network design in governance necessarily, but I think it is important to think about that beforehand, because as you can see, there's some complexity in kind of layering your network security, much like you would do on-prem. I mean, we make it really easy for customers to deploy things quickly in Azure, but when you don't do it in a thoughtful manner, you might end up encountering some restrictions that security might not necessarily be able to entertain to go live with.
I'm not sure we have time for a philosophical question, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And for those of you who are watching and want to read about this later, I am providing the link to our reference documentation on the hub and spoke design, so you can get some more in-depth understanding of what this actually entails and how this is put together. There also are some templates out there that if you wanted to deploy a hub and spoke design directly into one of your subscriptions, there's actually a link in the documentation page where you can actually deploy a direct hub and spoke set of VNets directly into your subscription and start playing around with it and understand how it actually gets brought together.
Yep.
But using the green lines, the first green line being either a VPN gateway across the internet, or in an isolated manner, it would be ExpressRoute, combined with the peering connections between your virtual networks, that keeps all of those networks in an isolated environment. You can guarantee that no traffic is going to go out to the internet unless you specifically route it that way.
So, and peering is kind of like a form of MPLS in a way, right? I mean, we're putting traffic together in specific customer channels, so there's no mixing too. I think a lot of people get concerned from that perspective.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. So just to talk about some of the benefits, and some of these I've already mentioned, so I'm not going to spend a lot of detail or time into this. Cost savings, you're centralizing some of the services, obviously not all of them. Things like DNS servers, network virtual appliances there. I'm working with a customer right now that's putting in SMTP as a shared service. I didn't even know people still used SMTP until I started working with this customer. Jump boxes, that's another one. Virtual appliances is certainly one of the ones. I'll be honest, I'm not a fan of third-party services. I think Microsoft can provide anything that you want. I'm a little biased. But there are reasons. One of my customers right now, for example, is going to be leveraging Checkpoint firewalls, and I specifically asked, why are you using these? And they said because they need the intrusion detection, intrusion prevention capabilities of those firewalls. And that's true. We don't have a service like that inside of Microsoft today, and Checkpoint does it extremely, extremely well. So they put those in as a shared service inside of their hub network. It makes perfect sense.
Yep.
I talked about overcoming subscription limits, the peering of the VNets, the connection limits for ExpressRoute connections, things like that. You're able to overcome them in a hub and spoke network design. And then separation of concerns. Ryan, you're the one who brought this up about being able to provide access to only the networks that specific needs dictate. So I'll go back to my customer that deployed their SharePoint application. They have a specific cloud engineering team that owns the hub network. But then they only give access to the application teams to one of the spoke networks wherever their application's actually being deployed, thereby allowing them to limit those role-based access controls for each of those different teams.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Yeah.
Good design. Hey, I've got a question then. So what about a lot of our customers who've been working on Azure in the olden days, right? The old classic model.
Right.
So, a lot of our ARM-based deployments have really matured over the last couple of years, but we still have customers that sit in the classic. Any really concerns for our viewers when they talk about classic and ARM-based and how to hybrid between the two of those?
So as being one of the guys who designed the migration plans for ASM to ARM, or Classic to ARM, if you will, first of all, sit down with one of us cloud solution architects who go back to those olden days and figure out the best way to start to migrate. Because in order to take advantage of all of this newness, you got to be in ARM.
Yeah, that's a great point. So you're saying, I remember when I had to go uphill both ways and that sort of thing. Okay.
Yeah, barefoot in the snow. Yeah. Let me call my dad and get him to tell some of his stories. Okay, so let's move on to some of the technology that sits behind this. One too far. The first thing, the only way to guarantee an isolated design when needing to have on-prem access is ExpressRoute. Yes, we absolutely have, and Matt, you mentioned these site-to-site VPNs, and where you can connect a VPN device from on-prem to a VPN device inside of an Azure region that then translates to a virtual network, but that's an IPsec tunnel over the internet. That does not guarantee isolation. ExpressRoute is a dropped-in circuit from AT&T, Verizon, whoever your vendor of choice might happen to be, and it is then a guaranteed isolated network, and actually it's an active network connection between your on-prem into the Azure backbone. Now, there might need to be a provider sitting in between depending upon how you put it together, but in most, you can think of it as a direct connection between you and us.
Okay.
Once you're in your virtual network, you've got standard segmenting using your CIDRs for the virtual network and your subnets, but that doesn't guarantee isolation because the default routing of a virtual network allows outbound access to the public internet. That's where network security groups come into play. You can think of them as your standard stateless firewalls, and you can deploy them on the subnet, or you can deploy them on individual NIC cards for VMs inside of those subnets. And then you can control both inbound and outbound traffic at the IP and port level of different VMs or services within the scope of that virtual network. So now you're starting to lock down the traffic. But then you still have needs, and as much as we would all love to say that every single VM is going to be perfect for all time the minute you deploy it, that gold image idea, we all know operating systems get updated. Software gets updated. What happens when that situation comes into play? That's where user-defined routing is concerned. You're going to want to define when a Windows server needs to contact the Windows Update service. How can it get through and get to that information so that it can update itself? Or, if you really want to be isolated, you can deploy your own YUM apt-get servers inside of your own repositories, if you will, inside of your virtual network, and then you control all updating of your VMs. That's if you really want to be super paranoid.
Yeah, so YUM, I guess just for anybody who doesn't know, it's a package manager utility for some of the Linux distributions.
Really? Because I thought it was like YUM for the cider he was talking about earlier, so I wasn't sure.
Yeah. So, I think it's important to highlight that, if you establish some user-defined routes that sends that traffic from Azure back over the ExpressRoute connection to hairpin it out back over the customer's, internet connection, then, you do need to be cautious about sizing that ExpressRoute connection properly. I mean, if you have hundreds of machines in Azure that all do Windows updates at the middle of the night, I mean, you're sending a boatload of traffic over that ExpressRoute tunnel, and then hairpinning it back to the customer's devices they have in their network back out over their connection. I mean, and from a financial services standpoint, I know that they tend to be very finicky about wanting to really monitor and know what traffic is going where, but in some instances that might not be a good thing because we have a tremendous amount of bandwidth that they can leverage for doing things like updates and so forth that you mentioned, instead of doing having that sort of activity go over that user-defined route.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, I will say, having spent a lot of time in public sector and the federal government, it's surprising how many of those agencies actually prefer to deploy their own package managers or their own repositories for things like updates rather than leveraging or allowing any kind of outbound traffic.
Okay, interesting. Well, I guess that gives them control over what updates that they want to make available to the machines that are running. So that makes sense. Yep.
Absolutely. But as being a former IT guy from many, many years back, it's an administrative nightmare. It's not something I would want to do if I was their IT manager.
Yeah.
The last thing I want to talk about before I go and do some demonstrations, because I've already talked about VNet peering and all of the capabilities that it can provide, but I wanted to mention VNet service endpoints. And this goes back to the question, Ryan, that you asked earlier about leveraging some of those platform services that by default start with a public endpoint, a public URL, there's a public IP address sitting behind them. How can we leverage those inside of our virtual network without having to send traffic out to the internet? And this is something that we have just started making available inside of Azure. We have just recently made them generally available within the last couple of weeks, called VNet Service Endpoints. What this allows you to do is take either a storage account or an Azure SQL database, and instead of pushing it out there with a public URL, you actually make it part of one of your subnets. It now gets a private IP address, and the only accessibility to those services is now through that private IP address. It also then means that you get all of the other features inside of your network to help secure that particular service. So you get a firewall capability sitting in front of your storage account, for example. You are going to be getting access to role-based access control at the data plane layer inside of storage very, very soon. It's in preview right now, will be generally available later this year. So you get a lot more security capabilities around storage and SQL. Now, some of you who might be listening to this will go, Brian, well, that's great for storage and SQL, but I'm using this service or that service, or you mentioned Key Vault. What about Key Vault? We are working very, very diligently to get additional services available under this VNet service endpoint model so that they can have private accessibility and isolation just like storage and SQL can as well.
Sure. Yeah, and I know some services like SQL in particular, the public IP address still exists, but
Yes.
we just don't allow any traffic to come into it. So
Yeah, we just put some private ACLs is what I understand.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, let's check some of it out.
So we're over into the Azure portal, and Matt and Ryan, you all see this every single day, just like I do.
It's so pretty.
So this isn't new. This is one of my personal subscriptions, so there's not a lot in it because I don't want to have to pay for it. But let's start by talking about the governance side first and talk about where you can get access to that, because it's not exactly intuitive, unfortunately, as to where you're going to do that. You're going to go under your subscription specifically, and I'll just click here on my specific subscription. And underneath of here, you've got access to a lot of different things. But the two in particular that I want to cover are policies and role-based access control. Now, role-based access control can be done at the subscription, at the resource group, or even at the individual resource layer, and I'll show that in a little bit when we start talking about networks. But policies, you're going to access it from here underneath of your subscription, but then when you deploy your policy, you're going to define whether it's going to be deployed at the subscription layer or at the resource group layer.
Right, okay.
Actually, for those of you listening, there's going to be a new feature coming here very soon called management groups, where you're actually going to be able to create policies that go across multiple subscriptions, but that's not available quite yet. So in bringing up policies, we are first going to take a look at, now the assignments is just saying what policies have I already deployed and at what scope are they deployed. And once again, the scope is either at the subscription layer or at the resource group layer. But that really doesn't help you as a user or as a cloud architect understand what the policy is actually doing. So let's take a look at the policies. Now, we provide a large number of them out of the box, and you can see these are all built in. The only way to create your own custom ones is to is either through PowerShell or the CLI or through the SDK. Most people do it through PowerShell. There is documentation on how to do that. A policy is just defined via JSON documentation. So if I look at allowed virtual machine SKUs, now this is the example I used earlier of I only want to allow up through D3, and I don't want to allow any of the Godzilla servers or the really ginormous ones. So if I click on this,
you want to stop your employees from spinning up GPU boxes and doing Bitcoin mining.
Yes,
who would do that? I don't know. Who would do that?
Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't, but that's me. I have zero interest in Bitcoin. I think that has a lot to do with it. So if I click on the JSON tab, now this is going to be hard to see in order to provide, I'm not even going to be able to show it. Let me do, just so I can show it to you real quickly. This is showing you the JSON that actually makes up. So we're talking about compute virtual machines. And then when it is a virtual machine, what is the list of allowed SKUs? Show standard A1, standard A2, through whatever you define. You can actually specify an array of VM sizes that are allowed. If you do not allow a specific VM size, what happens? A user, if they do it through the portal, and this is a great example because most people try and do things through the portal first, at least I do, is you'll get a little red message. When you click the Create button, before it even submits to the Azure SDK to actually create that VM, it actually checks the policy first. And if the policy denies it, then you'll get a little red message stating that it was denied because of XYZ policy.
Okay.
At which point, you go in, you make your fixes to the wizard, and everything gets processed successfully.
Okay, cool.
So this is the way that you would deploy those kinds of policies. Once again, these are all available out of the box. You can take a look at them whenever you happen to have time. If you want to create any custom ones, then you're going to want to do that through PowerShell.
Okay.
Now, role-based access control. Right up here at the top, as I said, you can do that. This particular window is available pretty much on every resource that you go into inside of Azure. You're going to be able to provide role-based access control at a very high level as well as at a very low level.
Yeah, I always explain to this as being akin to like NT file system permissions. You have it like
Absolutely.
At the machine, the folder, and the file level would be kind of an analogy. Subscription, resource group kind of being the container, a bunch of assets, or the asset itself.
Absolutely.
I think there also needs to be some word of caution here too, because one of the times I find is customers will dig real deep into RBAC, and the next thing you know, they're like, "This isn't working," and it turns out they didn't go through and read the role dependencies, because sometimes you need to have two different roles to do, let's say, backup services.
Yes.
Right. So that's probably another good area that we plan, test plan.
Very much so. One other thing is make the decision early on. Do you even want to attempt creating custom roles? So my financial services customer, I've been talking about this entire time, made the decision that they did not want to create anything custom in any of their subscriptions. They wanted to only use what Azure provided. So if they couldn't find a role that didn't fit for them, well, then they didn't find a role that didn't fit for them. They find something else to be able to do what they needed it to do. We have a huge list of roles. If I click here, I can actually specify the group. Well, those are group bys. Here are the roles, and you can actually click on every one of these roles and then view then all of the individual permissions. And this list continues to grow as we add additional services, as we add additional features to services, and you'll see which ones are listed under preview. For example, here are the data plane ones for the storage account that I talked about a little while ago.
Yeah, we'll put in the show notes. There's a bunch of built-in roles. It's well documented on our.
Yes.
Okay.
So
cool.
All I'm going to mention here real quickly, and then I want to move over to networking, is you can add users, you can add groups, but the one thing to be aware of for all of you sitting out there that are customers is you have to have Azure Active Directory synced with your users and groups. If you're creating a pay-as-you-go subscription with what we call live accounts or Microsoft accounts, you actually cannot use role-based access control. You have to be synchronized with Active Directory in order for this functionality to work, and that's actually true for resource policies as well. Okay, let's move over into networking, and the starting point, virtual networks. And I will create a brand new virtual network here and just show you what the defaults are for a virtual network. You're obviously going to give it a name, and you're going to specify your CIDR or your IP address space for those who don't know what CIDR actually stands for. And by the way, I don't know what the acronym actually corresponds to. I just know that I use the term all the time. You're always going to specify, I'm dead serious. I do it all the time. You're also going to specify a, oh wow, I cannot spell, a resource group, and a resource group is just a logical container for a set of resources that have similar categorization or similar organization, similar security, similar auditing, whatever it might happen to be from your business requirements perspective. You're going to specify, obviously, a region. One thing to be aware of with respect to VNet peering that we've been talking about, peering between virtual networks in the same region, 100% capable across all regions today. But if you want to peer networks across regions, in other words, east to west, north central to south central, not all regions allow for that capability yet today. That is going to change, of course, over time.
Yeah, I know. I think it's West in Canada that have that enabled right now. So.
Okay. So I'm just going to leave it as West. Now, do I want service endpoint? So remember, do I want to deploy a storage account into a subnet? I'm going to enable service endpoints, but then I have to specify which services. I only want to worry about Microsoft Storage. I don't have any database services, or I don't plan on deploying any database services. You could, but this is where you're going to actually turn that on.
You can change that absolutely back too.
Absolutely. It is completely configurable. So let's go ahead and click Create. And it's going to go off and running. We might want to pause here.
Someone go feed the squirrels.
I never know from region to region how long it's going to take.
Yeah. No.
Oh, there we go. Hey.
Told you. It's feeding time at the zoo.
So as you can see here in my notifications, my resource has been deployed, my virtual network. So let's go ahead and click into it. Let me close my notification. And we've got our virtual network. Now, the most standard things are talking about the address space, the subnets. You can obviously add additional subnets. You cannot change IP address spaces after the fact. Trust me, I tried. All kinds of error messages come popping up. You can specify DNS servers, but here are the peerings. So if I had a second virtual network, I can actually here connect those two virtual networks, at which point they now act as the same network. And it's as simple as just clicking Add. I don't think I have any additional virtual networks here, but I could actually choose a second virtual network. No, I don't. If I had a second virtual network, I could choose it here. You name the actual peer. In other words, you're basically giving a name to this pairing.
Yeah. You have to do this on both sides. So
yes.
Like if you have permission to maybe a development environment or network that you set up yourself, and you wanted to peer this to a production environment, you can't just do that. You can do it on your side. Somebody has to go on the other side and also add the peers to actually make it operational.
And that is extremely important point with respect to role-based access control. When you define a specific set of users having access to production but not having access to maybe one of the other networks, or vice versa for that matter.
Right.
The reason, though, I want to bring this up, even though I can't necessarily connect two networks together at the moment, is talking about these configurations here. Do I want to allow forwarded traffic? Do I want to allow gateway transit? Do I want to use remote gateways? These are things that you want to turn on or off. I always allow forwarded traffic because I want to make sure the traffic can easily flow back and forth. The remote gateways and gateway transit is, do I want to allow traffic from a gateway in another VNet to actually come into my VNet? In other words, a user is coming from on-prem. They're coming from ExpressRoute to the hub to the hub, to the spoke. Do I want to allow that kind of traffic to be allowed? And I just used the same word 3 times.
Yeah.
There's no judgment. It's okay.
Yeah. And that would be, the inbound, and then you also have to use remote gateways where you allow traffic to go from here back to the hub and then back over to the private network on-prem, if you will.
Right.
Yep. Okay.
And I will say, in the case of my financial services customer that I've been talking about, they absolutely turned on all 3 of these. But the great thing about this being configurable and checkboxed is you can do it such that, well, you only want to do it for this application and this spoke network, but hey, I don't want to do it for this other spoke network over here. In other words, maybe I want to allow forwarded traffic, and that makes sense, peer-to-peer, but I don't want to allow traffic back to on-prem. Because sure. This is maybe a public-facing application rather than an internal application.
And then you can go a step farther and actually apply ACLs to prevent this subnet and this IP, or maybe actually the reverse would be more like allow would be typically how that's done. Block everything and allow what only the traffic that you know and trust. If you have a shared database server, you want an app server running maybe in a staging environment to talk to that database server, you could put ACLing in place to be able to allow just that traffic to occur.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So let's go back to the network and talk about the service endpoints. So we did turn on storage, but if I actually click on the storage, you'll notice there's nothing here at the moment. I can absolutely add a storage account, and I'm almost positive you can specify which subnets are actually in here.
Yep. I've seen that. That's pretty cool stuff. So then you can take like server in the bottle kind of approaches if you need to isolate up.
Yep. Now, in order to actually make this function, though, you'll notice I have no way of adding a specific storage account to the subnet. You actually have to do that on the storage account side. So I happen to have a couple of storage accounts here. Unfortunately, though, they're in different regions, so I'm not 100% positive that this is going to work. And I've just got to find where we might want to pause here. Is it under configuration?
Firewalls and virtual network.
Oh, firewalls and virtual network. Got it, right? Okay. Yep. We're good. Okay, so underneath of storage, we've got a navigationable item called firewalls and virtual networks. And then we can specify, do we want to allow all virtual networks to access this or only selected networks, at which point then you can pick a virtual network as well as a subnet, address range, and then what do you want to allow access to use this storage account for? Trusted Microsoft services. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
So it'd be interesting to actually try to add existing network. You said the storage account was a different region. I think this is in the east and the... Okay.
This is in South Central, the virtual network's in West, so let's go ahead and add an existing network.
See if it shows up.
All right, that's my subscription. No, it doesn't even show up.
So it is very region specific. Okay.
And that's actually good because of performance concerns.
Yeah. I was just curious if it showed up. Okay.
Yeah, as was I. You do have a firewall in front of the storage account. Now, obviously, you can put a network security group in front of the subnet, but storage accounts, much like SQL servers do or Azure SQL does have a built-in firewall capability all on its own. So you can absolutely leverage that in addition to the network security group if you choose.
Yep.
So you then specify exceptions to the firewall where maybe you want to make sure to allow Microsoft Trusted Services, or do you want to allow read access to storage logging or storage metrics from the specific network?
We should highlight Microsoft Trusted Services doesn't mean you, Matt, or I having access to customers.
Oh, come on. You can trust me. That's what I always tell you. You can trust me.
Yeah, that's referring to services like backup or those types of services.
Integrated services, Azure integrated services.
Right.
So those two pieces combined is how you're going to make a storage account part of your isolated system. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about, and we did mention this with respect to governance, and I forgot to do it at the top, is auditing. So as much as you can prevent things from happening, as much as you can make sure that someone doesn't do something that they're not supposed to do, yeah, you might have missed something. You might not have put a policy in place that you needed, or you might have given someone a role that gave them access beyond what you had originally expected. And that's really where your monitoring and auditing comes into play. Now, we have two major flavors of auditing and monitoring inside of Azure. One is you're absolutely going to pay for, and that's the log analytics service. However, I am a gigantic fan of that service, and I highly recommend it to everyone. However, you're just getting started. You're just learning Azure. You want to be able to make sure before you move something into production that you can see what's going on. If you go under Azure Monitor, there are a lot of different capabilities in here, including alert management, being able to look at diagnostic metrics, things of that nature. But the one in particular that Matt and I highlighted earlier is the activity log. And the activity log is what your audit trail absolutely is within the scope of Azure. You're going to be able to look at every single function that has occurred in your subscription. Now, when I say every function, I mean every create, update, or delete function. We do not track read functions, unlike a vendor that is on the other side of the lake from us. And we do that intentionally because the activity log is very, very full. So we don't need you to know whether or not someone can read something. But we absolutely want you to know when someone creates something, updates something, or deletes something. And all of those actions can be shown inside of here. And then you can absolutely see who absolutely did them. Let's actually click on, well, the one actually that I'm clicking on right now is when I created the virtual network. So underneath of here, I wrote a virtual network. Here's the timestamp and who it was initiated by. You can also see the JSON of this, which gives additional pieces of information pertaining to what actually occurred during this event. So you might want to create alerts or save searches against your activity log so that you can perform the auditing that is relevant to the systems that you are deploying inside of your subscription and inside of your virtual networks.
Sure. Yeah. This can get pretty sophisticated in kind of setting up alerting and so forth. But yeah, maybe as a final talking point, if you want to just show the Network Watcher and what capabilities exist there for being able. Yeah, so we built our network, we set up our peering, we set up our rules and routing, between all of those, and now we want to be able to ensure, or maybe actually a better question to answer is troubleshoot why server A can't talk to server B.
Right. Yeah. And unfortunately, you all could not see my face, but I smiled as Ryan was asking about Network Watcher. I love Network Watcher. I'm not even a networking guy, and I love Network Watcher.
But you're smiling in your avatar. That's all that counts, right?
Yeah, good point.
We took that.
So inside of Network Watcher, we're providing you a lot of troubleshooting tools or diagnostic tools that you might want to use in order to validate that traffic is making it to a specific VM. Or, hey, traffic seems to be flowing, but it seems to be flowing awfully slow. Why might that happen to be? So being able to use some of these diagnostic tools here allows you to say, okay, what's the next hop when it leaves this VM? I know it's supposed to go to this VM, but is it going direct? Or is it maybe going through another VM that it shouldn't be? Maybe it's going through a proxy server and you hadn't actually defined that.
Or things network virtual appliance is blocking it or something like that. Yeah.
Yes. Yep. Doing a security group view allows you to validate the applied network security groups, the effective applied network security groups on a subnet, on a network interface, so that you can make sure that the right ports and right IP address ranges are in fact open when they're supposed to be or closed when they're supposed to be. You can do VPN diagnostics. That goes back to those VPN gateways, making sure that you're getting good traffic flow from on-prem. If you need to look at a specific packet, you can do a packet capture and then look at all of that data.
So I know in the on-premises world, typically the network, network telecommunication folks have tools, Wireshark and Netmon that they can set up, promiscuous, network interfaces and capture information, kind of see what's going on. Azure makes that a little bit more challenging because it's a software-defined network. You can't just jack in and capture, traffic flowing across the virtual network, if you will, within Azure. In-packet capture is a way for you to be able to instruct Azure to capture that for you. And you can analyze it using, Wireshark or Netmon.
The other reason why I smile whenever I talk about Network Watcher is this top item. Now, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to show you much because I don't have much deployed. But what this gives you is an actual graphical view of a specific virtual network and everything that's in it. It'll show VMs. It'll show load balancers, IP addresses, network security groups, NIC cards, all of the resources that you deploy into a virtual network will absolutely get put here into a nice and pretty diagram that you can then export out to a TIFF file, I believe is what it is. This has been fantastic for me as a cloud solution architect to be able to show to a customer, this is what your virtual network looks like, rather than having to sit down and hand draw a Visio diagram.
Basically establishing a service map of sorts.
Yes.
And using the ITSM, IT service management vernacular. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
this has been really helpful, Brian, kind of walking through some of the many different features instead of kind of focusing on just network or just monitoring and diagnostic, kind of, distilled everything down that exists in Azure to, lock down and secure and isolate an environment that a customer might be deploying.
Right. Yeah, all of the major features and services that you need to think about if you're going to be deploying an isolated system. And let me go back here. The last thing, and we're going to provide this PowerPoint deck, is I'm providing some additional links here for access, for example, to the reference architecture documentation for the hub and spoke design, information about ExpressRoute, VNet peering, network limitations, make sure you know what they are. There's nothing worse than all of a sudden, without even realizing it was going to happen, hitting one of those. I will tell you that for those who deploy isolated systems, one of the most common limitations that customers run up against, and I've had some of my customers do this, is the routing tables. Those routing tables will support up to 400 entries by default, and in an isolated environment where you're really wanting to control traffic, whether it's between VMs or on-prem to VMs, whatever it might happen to be, those routing tables can get to be pretty full pretty quickly. So be aware of what your limitations are. And then I'm also providing you with a link to an example ARM template so that if you want to deploy your own peered set of VNets, you can absolutely do that.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Brian. And
yeah, thank you, Brian.
Yeah, you're certainly welcome.
All of our viewers out there, this is your cloud simplified. Hopefully this was worthwhile and help distill down some of these complex topics and capabilities in Azure that you can apply in workloads that you're deploying yourself.
Yep, I'm going to get me some yummy cider at this point.
And I believe I'm going to be providing my Twitter handle, so if anybody's got any questions, feel free to reach out to me and ping me, and I'll try and help you as best I can.
Sure, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for coming on.
No problem. Thank you.